A legend tells how Zeus winged his way to my mother Leda's breast in the semblance of a bird, even a swan, and thus he fled from an eagle's pursuit, achieved by guile his amorous purpose, if this tale be true. My name is Helen, and I will now recount the sorrows I have suffered. To a hollow vale on Ida came 3 goddesses to Paris, for beauty's prize contending. Hera and Cypris and the virgin child of Zeus, eager to secure his verdict on their loveliness. Now Cypris held out my beauty, if anything so wretched deserves that name, as a bride before the eyes of Paris, saying he should marry me. And so she won the day, wherefore the shepherd of Ida left his steading and came to Sparta, thinking to win me for his bride. But Hera, indignant at not defeating the goddesses, brought to naught my marriage with Paris, and gave to Priam's princely son, not Helen, but a phantom, endowed with life that she made in my image out of the breath of heaven. And Paris thought I was his, although I never was, an idle fancy. Moreover, the counsels of Zeus added further troubles unto these. For upon the land of Hellas and the hapless Phrygians he brought a war, that he might lighten Mother Earth of her myriad hosts of men, and to the bravest of the sons of Hellas bring renown. Oh, hi. Hello there. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, whose voice is only just waking up, lover of Euripides and all things ancient and weird, Liv. Once more, we are returning to the life and times of Euripides to look at what exactly might have been going on in the mind of one of the most fascinating men of classical Greece. If you ask me, the most fascinating. That passage I just read was the opening of Euripides' Helen, as you might have expected, and a delicious example of how he often depicted the gods, just as they were in the surviving mythos, meddling, menacing, and often murderous. We've already looked quite a bit at Euripides' life, so for the most part, we're going to leave behind the biographical bits and pieces and settle ourselves in the classical Athens of Euripides. Last week, we looked a little at the politics of the period, the good and the bad, the flaws in the earliest form of democracy, and how maybe, just maybe, political theory didn't peak 25 centuries ago. And I'll clarify again that I don't mean to suggest that just because democracy as we know it in the West doesn't actually serve the people it purports to serve, doesn't mean we shouldn't be voting and participating in our democracies. Only that we should simultaneously push for actual, real change and stop relying on the worst of all evils as the choice, rather than the progressive candidates who might look like they don't have a shot. Because guess what? If no one ever votes for the progressive candidates because they won't have a shot, then change will never actually happen, and we will all continue on living in a world where the rich have a say in the laws that govern the people, even when those same people can barely break past the capitalism of it all, the lobbying and funding of politicians, the broken and flawed system that we've been taught to believe is the only option we've got. Even if the candidates might be all pretty terrible and pretty murderous overseas and pretty hateful of poor and marginalized people everywhere. Anyway, vote in elections, but also let's all just stop accepting the idea that the least of all evils is the only way to live. Okay? Today, though, I promise no more rants on our modern political structures, and instead, more love for Euripides. What I don't promise, though, is a particularly pious episode. Because today we are talking about Euripides and his relationship with the gods. This is episode 275, Apo Mechanis Theos, Deus ex Machina, gods in the machine. Before we talk about how a playwright in classical Athens portrayed the gods of ancient Greece, we have to remind ourselves of the distinction between myth as a concept and religion, and the ancient plays as mythical traditions of that religion. Because, they are and they aren't myths. Myth is a tough word to define. It comes from the Greek mythos, which really just means story. By that definition, everything that tells a story is, in a way, a myth. But for our purposes, the plays by the tragedians are not really myths in and of themselves. Instead, what they are contemporary adaptations of the myths of their time. The myth of Medea was long-standing, the witchy woman from Colchis who accompanied Jason and the Argonauts on their journey to steal the Golden Fleece. It was a long-standing tradition of cultural mythos by the time Euripides took hold of Medea's character. She existed, her story existed, much of the story that Euripides gives us existed, and would have served as his inspiration and background, but that doesn't mean that every little detail that's in Euripides' version of Medea's story was actually part of the cultural mythological tradition. For instance, remember the earliest surviving version of Medea's story where she kills her children is only Euripides. Did he invent that detail or take it from something that existed earlier? We don't know. It doesn't make it less important or less interesting, but it is important to delineate between the gods of the cultural tradition of ancient Greece and the gods of Euripides, because these plays are very simply reception. They are theatrical adaptations of pre-existing stories. Euripides, like me, is sharing his adaptation of the myths of his time. He's just a hell of a lot closer, chronologically, to their inception. But by the time Euripides was writing his versions of Athena, Apollo, Dionysus, the gods had already been around for hundreds of years and actively worshipped as the primary religion of the region for maybe even over a millennia. It's like writing a movie about Jesus, only way, way more fun. Most importantly, and what I'm most interested in looking at in today's episode, though, is the ways in which he played with the characters of the gods. The ways he made them look pretty bad, petty, angry, vengeful, even criminal, and what that might have meant for him as an artist in the ancient world, and what those in attendance watching his plays might have taken from his works. Because a guy who wrote Apollo as a violent rapist whose victim spends well over a decade ruminating over her hatred of him couldn't have had particularly strong devotion to that same god and still expect to have a half-decent relationship. And the atheist in me wants to dig my grubby little hands into Euripides' terrible and lovable, fearful and funny interpretations of the divine. There's an article called The Masque of Dionysus by Helen P Foley that we'll be digging from, among other things. But as Foley describes Euripides and his relationship with the gods, he was, quote, less interested in a self-conscious exploration of his own drama than in the way art interprets human and divine experience for the city. Changing your form, you will become a dragon, and your wife, Harmonia, Ares' daughter, whom you, though mortal, held in marriage, will be turned into a beast, and will receive in exchange the form of a serpent. And as the oracle of Zeus says, you will drive along with your wife a chariot of heifers, ruling over barbarians. You will sack many cities with a force of countless numbers, and when they plunder the oracle of Apollo, they will have a miserable return. But Ares will protect you and Harmonia, and will settle your life in the land of the blessed. That is what I, Dionysus, born not from a mortal father, but from Zeus, say. And if you had known how to be wise when you did not wish to be, you would have acquired Zeus's son as an ally, and would now be happy. Those were Dionysus's last lines of the Bacchae, though what came for them is tragically a little bit missing. Greek tragedy, as you've probably already learned through these Euripidean episodes, or surely will understand even better soon enough, was incredibly formulaic. This probably developed originally out of necessity during the invention of theater and drama and as concepts and art forms in the ancient world, but eventually became cultural tradition that would change only a little bit over the centuries. As you heard in the first episode of Hermes' Historia that aired last week, and over the years of this show, the basics are this. By the time of Euripides, Greek tragedy traditionally utilized 3 actors to play all of the varied characters. It's where we get the word protagonist, the actor who played the main part and usually was reserved for only one character in the play, the deferential, the actor who played the major secondary characters, provided it, worked with the stage directions that are, of course, lost to us today, and the tritagonist who played the rest. They wore robes and platformed shoes and masks to convey their characters and allowed for these quick costume changes of shared actors. And there were, for the most part, even more rules. Like I said, it was just formulaic. So, in general, you could expect that any divine characters in the play would or should appear in specific places. The Theologion, the roof of the stage building, and often the highest point of the performance stage was kind of the generally accepted space for the gods, or, of course, the machine, the crane that functioned to fly divine characters over the stage and the mortals below. The apple Mechanis Theos, the Deus ex Machina. Both mean gods in the machine. The crane wasn't always used, and it was a bit of a later invention, but the idea of having the gods appear over and above, higher than the mortals, seems to have been a long-standing tradition, from as far back as we know of tragedy. And then there's Dionysus in Euripides' Bacchae, who just comes in and breaks all of the rules. Which is why we'll start there. Unlike the usual representations of the divine in Greek tragedy, Dionysus wasn't above the mortals on the Theologion in the Bacchae, but instead he was amongst them, disguised as one of them. This immediately makes him a bit of a question mark, like this contradiction. Not only that, but because of how Dionysus appears in the text of the play itself, we're actually able to determine so much more about this play that in other cases is just simply non-existent. Because remember, no ancient Greek stage directions survive. We have no confirmed idea of how they performed each play, who was on stage, and when, where they went or when. Like, really, all we have are the words themselves and what those words tell us, and thankfully, many brilliant scholars' minds. But in Bacchae, things get a little easier. It's not that we have stage directions, only that the play itself gives us a huge number of directions within the dialogue. As Foley puts it, quote, "The language of the plays refers with remarkable frequency to the visual and musical experience on stage and emphasizes that both honoring and comprehending the god are essentially theatrical acts. An exploration of the nature of illusion, transformation, and symbol." What this means is that in Bacchae, we already have so much more than the majority of other plays. We know, generally, what Dionysus was wearing. We know what his maenads were wearing, what Pentheus was wearing. We know, for the most part, who went where and when, because it is all talked about amongst the dialogue itself. And best of all, we know that the Masque of Dionysus was smiling. Smiling throughout the play, smiling probably even as he had his cousin ripped apart by their own family. And I think that maybe, just maybe, this interpretation of Dionysus says something about not only how Euripides saw the god Dionysus specifically, but how he saw divinity more broadly. More than that, though, it also reminds us just how differently the people of the ancient world saw their gods and their religious practices generally, especially compared to the Abrahamic religions that were still to come. Euripides, because he's truly after my own heart, seemed to be more than happy to make the gods look terrible, while still, obviously, respecting them. This is true far beyond the Dionysus of Bacchae. And as much as I would love to devote more of this episode to the Dionysus of Bacchae, well, turns out I'm far too verbose when discussing Euripides, and this is all just never going to fit into one episode. And Bacchae is, if anything, a particularly unique way of looking at the gods. For many reasons, it doesn't fit, even with the wider tradition of Euripides' works, in terms of how it portrays gods and what that might have meant to Athenian culture. And most importantly, Bacchae was performed after Euripides died, so it's also one of the latest plays he wrote and probably says something about where he was at that point in his life. So for now, we're going to set the murderous rampage of Euripides' Dionysus aside, but I think we might have to revisit him before long. For now, we need to talk about the rest of the gods. Gods that Euripides inserted into well over half of his surviving plays, and which tell a bizarre and sometimes baffling, sometimes entirely expected story of ancient Greek gods and their interactions with other divinities, mortals, heroes, and I suppose, in the case of Euripides' work, the stage itself, theater as a concept, and the Athenian audience for which it was performed. Spoilers, there's lots of Athena. Wide over man my realm extends, and proud the name that I, the goddess Kypris, bear, both in heaven's courts and amongst all those who dwell within the limits of the sea and the bounds of Atlas, beholding the sun god's light. Those that respect my power I advance to honor, but bring to ruin all who vaunt themselves at me. For even in the race of gods this feeling finds a home, even pleasure at the honor men pay them. Those were the opening lines to Euripides' Hippolytus, which we are likely to return to sooner rather than later on this show. I mean, for the whole... It was Aphrodite speaking. I cut her off before she spoiled the plot of the play, but she is ready to punish the living fuck out of Hippolytus. But it's Athena who appears most often in Euripides' plays. But we shouldn't be surprised about that. She's Athens' goddess after all, and it makes perfect sense that she would appear most often compared to the other gods. She's also, from what I've read for today's episodes and the entirety of my own Euripidean knowledge, one of the least exciting of his gods. And of course, by least exciting, I obviously mean least weird and interesting. Athena, it seems to me, tended to be used more by Euripides to move the plot along and even to just convey messages from other gods who weren't being depicted on stage for more interesting reasons. This is true of the Ion, of Iphigenia among the Taurians, and more. Athena doesn't take the blame or accountability necessarily for her relatives, but instead serves as maybe a kind of mediating voice in some cases, and in others, a mouthpiece for gods who might not be able to show their faces, say, in the Ion. But we'll get there. I'm sure I don't need to remind you all, but the main way in which the Greek gods differ from our more modern religions is that they didn't automatically give a fuck. There was no guaranteed love from God, no assumption that a simple silent prayer was as good as the sacrifice of an entire cow. You had to work for the gods' respect in the ancient world, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. The gods were not all-powerful, not omniscient. They couldn't do anything they wanted, anytime they wanted. They were powerful, yes, but they were also broken and flawed and human and ripe for weird interpretations by weird little guys like Euripides. Apollo was a god to be worshipped and loved, surely, but he was also a god known to assault mortals and leave them far worse off than before they met him. Aphrodite was known to be fickle and jealous, more than eager to punish someone for wronging her in even the slightest of ways. But even if these types of personality traits were well known to the people of ancient Greece, that doesn't mean it wasn't a potentially problematic idea to actually visually present gods as horrible, dangerous criminal beings capable of great violence and destruction. The Hippolytus is a great example of this happening in practice. It isn't a play I've covered before on the show directly. I was worried about it, and I still a little bit am, but I have every intention to now before long. And as Isabelle Torrance says in her book, Euripides, quote, in Hippolytus, for example, the servant prays to Aphrodite to overlook Hippolytus's folly, suggesting that gods should be wiser than mortals. But we know from Aphrodite's appearance in the prologue that she has already planned her revenge on Hippolytus, and this is confirmed by Artemis in the Exodus. I won't spoil all the details of Hippolytus by sharing more about this revenge of Aphrodite's, but this remains a really interesting example of the ways in which Euripides plays with the idea of the gods. Aphrodite lays out, even in the prologue, that she intends to punish the mortal Hippolytus regardless of the play's outcome, and yet even still, we have this servant praying for her for another outcome. And it reminds me of the Ion, too, the play we covered earlier this year, where Apollo is presented right from the start as being a criminal god guilty of raping a woman and impregnating her, the results of which are the premise of the play. And even though Apollo is presented immediately as being a piece of shit, he's still worshipped throughout. Because that's just the honest truth about the ancient world. The play is still about his oracle at Delphi, and the people of that town remain as devoted to him as ever before, and yet we, as the audience, get this, terrible taste in our mouths because we have to watch both the worship and the ramifications of his actions. He's presented as having gravely wronged Creusa. She's presented as dealing with very real PTSD, as having experienced something truly traumatic, and yet the god remains one to be worshipped and respected. That's facts. And honestly, for me, that's the most interesting part of these ancient Greek gods broadly. I personally am not a pious woman. I don't desire anything that modern organized religion has to offer. But what I do love is looking at the ways in which the ancient Greeks respected and feared their gods. The way they were never meant to be perfect, flawless, divine beings that do no wrong, but instead were absolutely fucked up and sometimes out to lunch entirely. Euripides, I think, thought the same, and was keen to show this to his audience, to poke fun at some of the absurdity of the gods in his cultural tradition, and maybe even attempt to subtly point out the ways in which the world he lived in made life terrible for women and other marginalized groups. Torrance also uses Euripides' Andromache as an example, and that's another play that I'm so fucking eager to cover on the show. In the Andromache, a play about the wife of Hector and princess of Troy being sold off to Achilles' son Neoptolemus after the war, and who, Torrance says, quote, is murdered in an ambush led by Orestes in the temple of Apollo at Delphi, while he is attempting to make amends and pay the penalty to the god for a previous impious request. In that play, the messenger tells the audience of the fate of Neoptolemus at the hands of Apollo, of all gods, and how poorly he was treated by the god. The messenger says of Apollo, quote, like a base mortal, he remembered old quarrels. How then can he be wise? This is a bit of a running theme in Euripides, this idea of questioning the wisdom of the gods based on their actions within the play. As Torrance points out, still in the Andromache, which I promise we will get to within the next year on the show, because gods, I really want to read it. Quote, divine authority makes it clear that the murder of Neoptolemus was reprehensible, but puts the blame squarely on the shoulders of the humans, thus avoiding the question asked by the messenger and essentially refusing to answer it. Euripides makes this clear point to define the actions of the gods as morally criminal. He blames them explicitly for their actions, but he keeps his plays within the reality of his audience. The gods may have done terrible things, they may have killed or caused the deaths of innocents, may have committed earthly crimes, but they remain gods. Apollo is chastised, but ultimately that's all Euripides can do, and he knows that. Honestly, though, that to me, is everything. Euripides knew his audience. He knew what he could and couldn't say within the confines of Athenian society and their piety. He knew how to critique the gods through the myths he chose, and that he could make well-informed and well-argued criticisms of the culture surrounding the Olympian gods and the actions that they're understood to have committed without necessarily explicitly getting himself into trouble. Not that he didn't have haters. Stranger, your being surprised at my tears shows you've been brought up to be kind-hearted. When I caught sight of Apollo's halls, an ancient memory coursed back through my mind. My heart dwelt on my life at home, though I am here. Women's lives are full of woe. Gods can be so ruthless. What can be done? Where, how can we recover justice if we are ruined by the injustice of those who rule us? The Ion is one of the best examples of Euripides criticizing the gods clearly and loudly within his plays. That was a line from the chorus. They're speaking of the crimes of Apollo against Creusa. To Ion, the result of those crimes. Fortunately, we've covered the Ion recently. If you haven't listened to those episodes from earlier this year, I seriously recommend you do, because that play is utterly incredible in the ways in which it slams the actions of the gods, like lays out just how disgusting and terrible Apollo and Zeus and Poseidon behave towards mortals, clarifies that it is morally reprehensible, and that things like rape leave a lasting, life-changing trauma on the survivors of it. Euripides forces his audience to look closely at the sexual assaults committed by the gods and the resulting children, how those children often inadvertently threaten the lives of their mothers due to the cultural expectations placed upon Athenian women. But he doesn't go so far as to suggest a punishment for Apollo, or even suggest that his crimes make him any less worthy of worship. He just lets his audience sit in the crimes of their god. As Torrance says about the Ion, quote, "The title character rebukes Apollo as well as Poseidon and Zeus for raping young women and then abandoning them along with their offspring." In the end of the Ion, Euripides' audience has been given a long list of crimes by the most powerful gods, references to many stories which exist in their cultural lexicon, but he knows how this has to go. He can't actually suggest a punishment of Apollo on stage. That would be going too far. But as far as I can tell, Euripides was knowingly pushing that boundary by really emphasizing the criminal nature of the gods, like about as far as he could get away with. Remember, though the Ion is, at its core, about the harm inflicted on the mortal Athenian princess, Creusa, by the Olympian Apollo, it revolves entirely around the Oracle of Delphi and the prophetess of Apollo. And yet Apollo doesn't appear on the stage. He isn't actually a character in the play. Instead, Euripides has other gods working for him. Hermes tells the story at the beginning. He lays out what Apollo did to Creusa and how it affected her. And at the end, it's Athena who arrives to conclude the events of the play. And, as Torrance describes, quote, "We learn that she has been sent by Apollo, who did not want to be confronted by Ion about his actions. Once again, the reproach against the god goes entirely unanswered." Euripides loved to question the gods. Or rather, he loved to have his characters question the gods and then examine what that looked like in the ancient world. They question the gods. They call them out. The gods are even sometimes held at least a tiny bit accountable for their actions, but things could never change in any meaningful way. Like, he couldn't rewrite his culture's mythos and their religious practices, and I don't think he necessarily wanted to. It seems to be that he was more interested in posing the questions themselves. What might it look like if the women assaulted and impregnated by gods had their experiences validated by the world around them? What would it be like if things weren't quite as they seemed? If the true mortal Helen hadn't started the Trojan War, and instead, what if it was a phantom form of her, sent by the gods? Because This is what gods do. Euripides wrote a Helen of Sparta who not only never went to Troy in the first place, but also a Helen who questions her own parentage and birth story, one that is, and was, one of the most famous of all Greek mythological origin stories. Euripides wrote an Iphigenia who wasn't quite ready to believe the worst of her goddess, Artemis. As Torrance describes the Iphigenia of the Torrance play, quote, Iphigenia refuses to believe that the goddess Artemis delights in human sacrifice, or that the gods ate the flesh of Pelops when his father Tantalus served it up at the banquet. But, as she also reminds us, by the end of the play we're still to believe that Artemis is eager for human sacrifice, even now. And of course, there's Medea. A woman who is herself born of divine parents, who commits one of the most horrible crimes imaginable, whose husband, a hero, curses her over the body of their dead sons, and yet who still remains, in her own unique way, sympathetic. But even if she isn't, which, okay, fine, many people don't see her that way, even then, she still gets away with it. Euripides has Medea kill her children. He may have even invented it as a concept in his culture's tradition, and he doesn't have her punished even in the slightest. I don't necessarily think this example fits into the same general idea as the others, but it absolutely still provides an example of Euripides not only playing with his audience's expectations of the divine, but also mothers, women, heroes like Jason, and even the conventions of tragedy itself. Using the machine, the crane, to fly Medea off into the sunset in a dragon-drawn chariot, holding the bodies of her children, wasn't really what the machine was meant for, but that wasn't about to stop Euripides. Haha, nerds! Thank you as always. God, I am fucking obsessed with this Euripides series. More even than I knew I would be, and it just feels like it's going to be endless. Because Euripides, and weird and divine crimes, I'm just obsessed. And in news that everyone expected, I can't say I'm finished talking about this aspect of Euripides' life and work. Like, Michaela found me so much more research than I was able to share today, and which absolutely ties beautifully in with the future episodes we had planned on him. So we are not leaving these divine interpretations behind. But for today, honestly, I've talked enough. On Friday, we have an episode with returning guest Tav Marshall, who comes on to talk about some of the other weirder things Euripides tried, attempts he made to play with the canon of mythological and tragic tradition, specifically his attempts to compete with the older and more widely respected Sophocles. On Tuesday, we're looking at Euripides' women and other marginalized people in his plays, and there's so much more to come. As I've mentioned so many times now, we've got, honestly, so many new things coming up with the show, most of which were delayed more than I expected them to be, but things are happening, and maybe soon, even more things. Weirdly, I feel like I've just finally gotten into the groove of this show after 7 years, and can finally expand into things that I've wanted for so long, to make changes that benefit both me and the listeners, and so much more. Now I'm rambling. More on that soon. For now, I'll let you know that I'll be doing a fun little crossover with a couple of podcasts you probably know and love. I think I've hinted at this already. I'm going to release something more official, but for now, I'm teaming up with the gals in Ancient History Fangirl and the lovely folks in Movies We Dig to hold a live stream event for International Podcasts Day on September 28th. We will be streaming from the Movies We Dig YouTube account. Keep an eye on my Instagram and future episodes for a link and reminders to that. And we're going to be drinking a little, talking all things myth, history, pop culture, and best of all, we're doing a reading of none other than Euripides' Bacchae. The version translated by past guest of the show, Emma Pauley, and it's going to be so much fun because I absolutely inserted myself into the role of Dionysus and I couldn't be more excited. More on that to come. Really, honestly, lately, if you want to up-to-date news on like anything to do with me or the show, you should be following the show's Instagram. It's just at Myths Baby, and it's basically the best way of reaching as many listeners as possible as quickly as possible, since the joy of podcasts mean they live on forever, and sometimes 7 years later someone comments like, what was that thing you mentioned? And I have to just stare blankly at a screen thinking, fuck, I have no idea. It's been a lifetime. Anyway, follow my Instagram, particularly for new and fun reviews, because I'm featuring new reviews these days alongside photos of particularly cute Greek cats. Because it turns out there's a use for the 1,000+ photos I have of Greek cats. I've been forgetting lately too, mostly because of the cats, but here is a reading of one of your amazing 5-star reviews, which you can also soon see alongside a cat on my Instagram. This review comes from a user called Silas512 in Australia. I love this podcast. Hi, I started loving mythology when I read the Percy Jackson books, and I was shown by a friend how to listen to podcasts, and I immediately started looking for a myth-based podcast and found yours after listening to some duds. I started at the beginning and loved it instantly, and then went looking for a mythology book and found the Gods, Goddesses, and Heroes Handbook a month later. I realized the author was Liv. I highly suggest this podcast. Thank you very much. The number of people that have bought my book not knowing I wrote it and are like separately listeners of mine, it's just, I love hearing that. It's so fun and joyous. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians. She is the producer. She did all of the heavy lifting research on this series. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. Brand new podcast art by The Angel Incarnate. Find a link to her work in the episode's description. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I love this shit very much. I really do. I really do. Fucking Euripides, man. Oh my god, I could talk about him forever.